Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 98, The Future of Torah. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this is our last interview as part of our series on regular Jews who are doing amazing Jewish things. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic again and again, but this is the last interview in this initial series here. Before we get started, we also wanted to say that this is the last episode of 2017, and we'd love to put in a last-minute request for philanthropic support for any of you who are waiting till the last minute to make some of your charitable gifts for the year. We would encourage you and beg you and ask you and request and be thankful in advance if you would go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate, where you have all kinds of options for ways to support Judaism Unbound, whether that's through a one-time gift or a recurring monthly donation through Patreon or any other set of ways that you might support us. Judaism Unbound is one of the most downloaded Jewish podcasts that there is. If everybody who listened donated $1 for every episode that they listened to, we would be in really good shape for a nonprofit organization. We'd be able to feed our families. We'd be able to create new content. We'd be able to expand what we're able to accomplish with Judaism Unbound as an organization. We're excited to tell you some of our plans in the year ahead, but those plans would really be helped a lot if we had the financial wherewithal to accomplish them, if we had the financial stability to know that this is a project that can go on and on and on. And that will really be helped by all the people who have listened to Judaism Unbound over the last year, jumping in and making even a very small donation. Again, we're only putting out there the idea that you might give us $1 for every episode that you've listened to. So if you've been listening all year, $50 would be a great gift. If you've been listening less than all year, just a few episodes here and there, perhaps you'd consider a gift of $18. And if you're out there and you're a foundation or a philanthropist who really believes that a project like this is important for the Jewish community, then we would really hope that you would consider larger gifts, whether it's $1,800, $18,000, $18 million, whatever you're able to give. We are so grateful for, and thank you so much for a wonderful 2017 where we had something on the order of 250,000 downloads of Judaism Unbound. It's really an incredible number, and that's thanks to you. So let's get into our interview with an amazing guest. His name is Brett Lockspeiser. He is the co-founder and currently the chief technology officer at Sefaria. That's Sefaria. You can get there at sefaria.org. Before founding Sefaria, Brett was a product manager at Google, where he led the team that created the Google News Archives. And we'll get into the story of the amazing way that he and a co-founder came up with the idea to create Sefaria, which they describe as engaged in the project of assembling a free library of Jewish texts and their interconnections in Hebrew and in translation. As we'll see in the interview, it's clear that Sefaria probably wouldn't have come about if it wasn't for the vision of somebody who was working outside of the Jewish community in Google and really kind of bringing that thinking into the Jewish community. So it's a great way to wrap up the interviews in this series, which we'll look forward to discussing in our show next week. But it's a great way of wrapping all this up and seeing just the power of coming from an outside perspective and imagining what can be done in the Jewish world in a profoundly different way. So without further ado, Brett Lockspeiser, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, I remember Sefaria being one of the earliest projects that somebody introduced me to, in this world of Jewish innovation, So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about what Sefaria is all about. What is it for our listeners who have no idea whatsoever?
Please, yeah. So Sefaria is a nonprofit organization, and our purpose is to create the future of Torah, to do it ourselves and to help others create the future of Torah. And when we think about Torah, we think that it has at least two sides to it. Jewish tradition talks about a written Torah and an oral Torah both being given at Sinai. And we think that that makes a lot of sense for the work that we do. The written Torah is texts. It's Jewish texts starting with Torah and Mishnah, Talmud, all of the volumes of commentary that come in between, the mystical dimensions in the Kabbalah, the legal dimensions in Halacha. We have this amazing tradition of every generation adding layers and dimensions to this interconnected textual-based conversation. So that's something that's fixed and that we're trying to bring online, make accessible to more people, make it free, make it reusable, make ways for people to get at it in its original and in translation. And then we're also thinking about the oral dimension of Torah, which is about conversation, about making meaning, about having face-to-face interactions, about bringing an ancient text and making it relevant to your contemporary life. So that's sort of in some ways, a more challenging side of the project where we're thinking about what can we do in technology to make oral Torah, the experience of meaning making, more interesting, more relevant, more engaging for more people.
So just to really simplify the first part, just so that our listeners can kind of understand the scope of what you're talking about, correct me if I don't have this quite right, but fundamentally your goal of Sefaria is to bring essentially every Jewish text from the past online in a free and ideally in the future translated way?
Yeah, that's the big vision, right? Is that if it's part of the giant Jewish conversation in text, then we want it to be freely available and connected to the rest of the text in the tradition. So we're working through the core canon. The library is now about 130 million words of texts. So it's a growing and large database. It's the largest database of English language Torah texts anywhere, and the largest free database of Hebrew and Aramaic texts anywhere. So yeah, it's a big project. I mean, I think there's definitely, like a lot of things, a head of the distribution and then a long tail. So we're certainly still focused on the head of the most important text that most people study most of the time. And then there's a longer tail of more and more Jewish texts that we'll be thinking about adding on also.
So what's on there now, basically? I mean, you have obviously the entire Torah and the entire Talmud. What else?
Well, so I'm going to just say, from my background, I've spent about a year of my life in yeshiva learning sort of seriously. So, not a ton, but enough to get a taste of what this whole tradition looks like. And we currently have about every text that I've ever heard of. And the list, the roadmap that we're continuing on now, better scholars on our team are prioritizing because they're texts that even I'm not as familiar with. But yeah, it includes the Torah, all of Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, in English and in Hebrew. A lot of commentaries, classical, medieval. We've got over 15 or 20 different commentaries in. It varies what we have available in translation now versus what we have just in the Hebrew, but we have more and more coming in English. So the Torah, the commentaries, the Mishnah, incomplete in English, a lot of Mishnah commentaries, the Talmud. One of our big pieces of news from the last year is that we were able to broker a deal with Steinsaltz and the Koren publishers to make a complete English translation of the Talmud available for free online. So you can go to Sefaria now and read the Babylonian Talmud in English. And then beyond that, we have a lot of halachic texts. These are the legal codes about how Jewish law is actually applied from the Talmud. A lot of texts in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, a lot of texts in Chassidut, sort of the also sort of mystical and moral dimensions of understanding the Torah. And then it goes on and on. We're starting now to include some contemporary texts as well, so getting into more contemporary commentary.
And beyond just having the text on there and even the translations, right, it's all kind of like if you go to a particular line in the Talmud and it references a verse in the Torah, that's all kind of clickable and you can navigate and move around from one thing to what it's that whole idea of the Talmud and the internet and this whole, network of ideas that actually sort of creates Jewish texts, that they're all networked to one another in this way that these, brilliant rabbis centuries ago had in their head. But now you're able to follow all those trails through the way the software is designed, right?
Yeah, it's a core focus of the project, and it's something we see as modeling a value in Torah itself, is that it's about connectedness and interconnectedness, that anytime you say something, you cite a source or you cite an opinion that came before that agrees or disagrees with you, but in any case, you want to be connected to the other texts and the other voices that are in the tradition. It's a great example of where, this ancient tradition and new technology really converge. We're building a network. We're building a graph that interconnects all of these conversations. We often talk about how you might think of the Jewish library as a bunch of books on a shelf, because that's how you've seen it in a Beit Midrash, in a learning hall, or in a library, that it's a bunch of discrete rectangles that are somehow separate from one another. But that's not actually the shape of the tradition. That's not actually how it functions. And like you were saying, if you're a great scholar and you've learned for years and years, you get to appreciate that. But it takes a lot of hard work to build up this visualization in your mind about how it's not just 1,000 rectangles, but it's actually one conversation, one network that spreads across time and space. And so we, have the opportunity to make that a priority in the application and in the data, that you can experience that by clicking on a line of Torah and seeing all the commentaries, all the places where it's requoted, following those lines along. So you click from one to another, and then that leads you somewhere else. So you get to build these wonderful trails as you traverse this network. So it's an experience in just the basic product of learning the texts on Sefaria. And we get to visualize it in other ways too, that we can actually take that data and make interactive graphical visualizations that show this network connectivity in ways that, haven't been visualized before, except in the imagination of great scholars.
So I didn't grow up with tons of Jewish textual experiences other than, Genesis and Exodus pretty much. And I started to explore it in college, and I had this really big Mishnah experience where I went into it, and I was totally floored that there was no way to access it online. I just assumed that there would be, this is the Mishnah, this is the first text in what is called the Oral Torah in rabbinic tradition. If you were going to make a list of most influential texts in human history, it wouldn't be, top 5, but it'd be on the list. And so I was really psyched to see Sefaria happen. But more than that, I'd love to hear from you, because it's more than just I got to see that Sefaria existed. I actually was able, as just a person, to at the early stage contribute myself through some translations. And I think that that's a really important element of what you've done, is that it's not just that people can go to a site and read text, it's that they can contribute themselves and edit and play a variety of roles in that way. So how, I guess to sum that into a question, how do the texts arrive from, a book or somebody's mind or whatever to Sefaria?
Good question. So, and the answer is also evolved over time for sure. It's different when we were, a side project and, just a little bit of nothing, and it was just me and Josh working together, than it is now, where we have a team. We have now 17 full-time employees working in 8 different cities, big hub in Jerusalem, New York, Chicago, St. Louis. I'm in San Francisco. Today, most of our texts are coming from scanning and digitization work that we do ourselves, together with partner organizations in Israel and New York. So we're actually taking books and physically scanning them, running through the process of turning images into actual text, and then taking that digital text and structuring it into the database. Sefaria is all about having a structured data for the text, not just images like PDFs. So we're working with actual books. We have a team that's doing corrections in that import process. And then for the translations, primarily we're working with publishers. So we're finding publishers that have high quality translations, and we're trying to broker deals with them where we do the fundraising to offer them a bounty for them to open up the translations from their restrictive copyright. Fortunately or unfortunately, translations that are created today carry a contemporary copyright. So if you write a translation of the Bible, we can't just put it up on the site for free. We need to get your permission. The model that we've been using, which is, I think, relatively novel in the world in general, is that we pay a bounty to a publisher, and they release the text with a Creative Commons license. but they retain the copyright. We don't buy copyrights from publishers. So the publishers are still free to do everything that they're doing. But in addition, the text becomes available for free online. And not just for Sefaria. These deals are not specific to us as an organization. They're sort of a broad license for the world at large that everyone can use and reuse these texts in all sorts of novel ways that we have even yet to imagine. At the very beginning of this project, I was working with my co-founder, Josh Four. It was a side project. We didn't have any budget. We didn't have any access to being able to pay digitization workers or publishers. So we built up a whole system of crowdsourcing, where we tried to make a platform for volunteers to come and help us get started, help us get an initial set of text and translations. And we did some campaigns that we organized to finish large translation projects. The Mishnah was one of them. As you mentioned, there was no complete English Mishnah online at that time, which was really shocking to us, really shocking and disappointing. So we wanted to set out to fix that. So we built a system where lots of people could come together and crowdsource a draft of a translation. Once we had a complete draft, we then went and assembled a team of reviewers and editors to spend a long time correcting for style and for content. But it was an amazing project because we were able quickly and relatively cheaply to get a translation out there. And I should say it's something that, of all the parts of the project, the crowdsourcing translation is the most controversial. It's the one that some people love. Some people think that this is a fantastic way to promote engagement and to get more voices into the work. And other people think, how on earth can I trust an anonymous person on the internet to translate this holy text for me? And it feels like a problem for the quality of the text. So for that reason, it's not our focus right now. And most of the translations in Sefaria are not crowdsourced. Currently, 9 out of 10 of the translations are coming from professional translators and publishers, and only a smaller amount are crowdsourced. But it is something that's really exciting for us in terms of getting participation. I think today, when we think about getting people participating in the project, it's not so much about doing the work of something like translating, but it's about being creative, about putting text together, making new questions, new commentaries. And that's something that's currently happening inside of source sheets on Sefaria. So we have a whole platform where users can pick from our library and create their own documents. Source sheets are this practice in Jewish education where you bundle together a bunch of important primary sources related to a particular topic. So you can bring in a piece of paper to your class and teach from it. So we were able to build an app that makes that process easier for educators to do. And in so doing, we've now created a user-generated space on Sefaria where people are expressing themselves, where they're having opinions, they're adding contemporary questions, they're adding images and videos, not just texts, but everything they do is connected to the source, that it's related to the primary sources in the library. So today, that's our main focus for where we're trying to channel the energy of people who want to volunteer and want to bring the project forward.
So I really want to jump back into that source sheet and all of that stuff in a little while, but let's back up a little bit and talk about the history of how Sefaria came to be, because this series that we're doing right now is where we're talking to folks that we basically call regular Jews, right? They're not people who decided to become a Jewish professional and were trained and became a rabbi or whatever, and nevertheless have done extraordinary Jewish things. And so I'd love to sort of understand better that origin story of Sefaria. Who were you before? Who was Josh before? And how did you sort of come to this incredibly audacious idea, which has now translated itself into an organization with, 17 staff members in what, 5 years? I mean, it's incredible.
So Josh Four and I met on the Bronfman Youth Fellowship, where we did this trip to Israel when we were both 17. Fell out of touch mostly after Bronfman. He became a science journalist. I got involved in technology, started working at Google. We reconnected around this idea. A mutual friend of ours sort of had heard that both of us were thinking about this space and put us in touch. So we had a phone conversation one day where we both kind of realized that we were both dismayed at the currently bad state of these texts online. Like you were saying, we couldn't find Mishnah online. The Talmud wasn't there, which was just shocking to us. And the possibility, the optimism that just seemed like there's so many obvious and interesting things that could and should be done if somebody would just, go ahead and give it a try. So we started working on it. My background is I grew up in Denver, Colorado in was involved in a congregation called Kohelet there, which is a non-denominational congregation, which doesn't have a rabbi, by design. We weren't religious. I didn't think of ourselves as religious, but we were not alienated from the tradition. Also, we were connected to, certain practices. My family was definitely interested in the spirit of questioning and thinking through Torah. There were some great teachers in that congregation who started off just doing text study that I got interested in. So I was learning Pirkei Avot and learning stories from the Talmud and just getting more and more connected and engaged with the texts themselves. So I went off when I was 16 to try to deepen my learning. I spent a summer in Israel in Efrat in the NCSY Kollel, which is an Orthodox youth group, and this was my first experience in an Orthodox Beit Midrash learning environment, which was both wonderful and shocking for me. It was definitely a challenging experience trying to grapple with my own personal and religious identity there. But I kept going with it. I got more interested after I was on the Bronfman Youth Fellowship with Josh. I stayed on in Israel and went to yeshiva called Bat Ayin. Stayed there for about 8 months that time and just got deeper and deeper into, my appreciation for the value of engaging with texts. Being in an ultra orthodox yeshiva for that amount of time also really helped to solidify for me the sense that I am not religious, actually, that I'm not Orthodox, that it's just not the way that I see the world or my relationship to the tradition. But it didn't break it. It didn't make me feel like I couldn't relate to the tradition. It's just that my relationship was as a secular Jew. So, when I left yeshiva, I went off to college. I was not involved in Jewish life. I didn't see myself as, having a career as a professional Jew at all. Definitely sort of felt like something that I stumbled into. But when I was talking with Josh, when we started talking about this idea, it just felt like it was a great intersection for me personally, that I had enough of a picture of what the Torah conversation looks like and a background in technology. Google sort of definitely trained me, maybe even indoctrinated me with the sense that access to information is inherently empowering. So we got started. We had the idea for a while. We didn't do anything with the idea. We then heard about a grant opportunity, a fund that came together specifically around Jewish new media innovation projects. Thought this was a perfect way to launch our idea. We wrote up a whole grant proposal about it and were rejected from that grant. We shopped around the grant proposal to a number of people and everyone was sort of like, yeah, right.
I mean, were they like, this is too unbelievable, like this is too big or something like that?
Yeah, when it was something that was just a grant proposal on paper. And Josh and I, neither of us have a background in the nonprofit world. Neither of us had a background in the Jewish world at all. So, even though we had done other things, in this world, we were kind of like just outsiders. And who were we? And we were proposing this really big, audacious project. And everyone just sort of said, nobody's done it yet, so why would you be able to do it? Or how much is that going to cost? Or the copyright holders are never going to want to work with you because they're trying to make money. So interestingly, I think for us, it was definitely a big motivator that we definitely realized that the idea didn't communicate on paper, that a grant proposal was the wrong way to pitch this idea. And so it motivated us to say, look, the way we have to do this is we have to show people. We have to demonstrate to people what this is going to feel like. So we spent, about 2 years just working on a prototype, just building a demo that people could get excited about. Early on, it was, Genesis chapter 1 was the focus. And it was just like, how many connections can we add to Genesis chapter 1 in an interactive environment? That was a time when we started recruiting volunteers to say, hey, just help us fill out more and more of this database. It doesn't have to be complete. It just has to be exciting. It has to have enough paths to follow to get you excited. And it really changed things. I mean, really, when we showed people, when I brought an iPad to a meeting and just showed people, here's the text, I click on this line, look what pops up. It stopped being, that's too big, we can't do it, to cool, we want this.
this series that we're looking at, right? I mean, it's almost like we're comparing and contrasting what a regular Jew can do and can't do versus what a highly trained Jewish professional could do and can't do, And when I think about your story, I mean, I'm thinking about let's at least start with what a regular Jew can do, right? That a professional Jew can't do, right? So probably a professional Jew, like a rabbi, isn't working at Google, almost by definition. So there's some element where you working at Google, right? You think about the audacious description that Google has of itself, right, as organizing all the world's information or whatever the catchphrase is. And so in a way, it feels like because you're in that particular environment, you're able to conceive of an idea that we could organize all of the Jewish information. And it just sort of sounds like, actually, I don't know, like when I think about it, it sounds like it's a little easier than what Google's doing. They're trying to organize all the information and we're only trying to organize the Jewish information. So for you, that sounds like a small project, relatively speaking, whereas for anybody who's in the Jewish community, it feels like overwhelming and crazy and ridiculous, which maybe explains some of the early resistance to giving you a grant to do something that sounds insane.
It was definitely the case for me, like you were saying, that coming from Google, I was able to conceive of this project as actually small. It's a huge project. It really is. But from some perspective, I was able to sit down and think, you know what? We're talking about the core. We're talking about 1,000 books. That's totally finite. And this is, part of our early pitch too, is to say, Google is putting up billions, if not trillions at this point of web pages in its index. We're just talking about getting 1,000 books really well structured in a database. In fairness, it's a bad comparison because what we're doing is actually a lot harder than what Google has to do in indexing a web page or in scanning a book. We're actually doing a lot more by bringing a consistent structure and segmentation and interlinking to all of these books. But still, it was a finite project in my head, not something that was totally unbearable. I mean, in terms in general about how to think about people bringing some kind of outside skill or creativity to a project without the content knowledge, I feel like it's just often the case, right? That you need outside perspective to push things forward, and that you need to have enough of a picture into a domain that you're trying to affect to at least have a grasp on what you can do and can't do. But there's something valuable also about having the naive optimism of not knowing how hard a problem is. Initially, the pitch was definitely, we're going to get every single Jewish text ever, and every single Jewish text is going to be translated into English. And that was what we were doing. That was what we were focused on. I think there's a common curve that you can see online for startups, where every startup begins with the sense of naive optimism that you just think we're going to change the world. And then you hit this moment of the informed pessimism where you learn more about your domain and you realize, oh, this is actually really hard. I don't know if we can deliver on all that we were promising before. And the success of a project like this is, can you come out of that into an informed optimism to say like, okay, I recognize there are these real challenges, but we found a path that works, that's still going to be meaningful and helpful. And I think luckily we were able to emerge on the other side of that core. And now we're definitely working on the informed optimism of the future of Torah.
First off, that's an awesome map that you just drew of the uninformed optimism to informed pessimism to informed optimism. That strikes such a chord. I mean, forgetting just online, I feel like that's been true of most of anything that I've been a part of, maybe either starting or being around in the early days of. There's always been that like, we're gonna rock it, then oh my gosh, what just happened, and then a little bit of equilibrium, hopefully. I love that. Anyway, I want to think back to some of the resistance you described, because I wish I looked out at this world of Jewish people and Jewish institutions, and I thought, the only reason this didn't happen in the past is because nobody tried or nobody fully committed. I think there was you'd know better than me, and that's why I'm curious to hear. I feel like there's some sort of thing in people, and it's definitely there for some more traditional kinds of Jews, but certainly for even some who aren't traditional, who feel like there's a reason that we kept these in a language that is maybe not unique to Jews, but largely spoken by Jews. There's a reason that we haven't gone and translated everything in English. Maybe some folks would argue it's good to have to, learn Hebrew, for example, in order to embed yourself in some of these texts, because that can open you up to other kinds of Jewish engagement. And if you translate it all into English, like, well, people aren't going to learn the Hebrew, etc. And similarly, I think people are reluctant about the digital world in a similar sense. There's this nervousness about what it means to make things online, and there's a general societal discomfort with what it means to be plugged in, and all of the baggage that comes with that, and the associations with distractions, etc. And I guess I'd love to hear from you about those twin resistances, or maybe they're separate resistances. How have you pitched to people that it is okay to get these texts translated and to open them up to English for the world? And how also have you convinced folks who are skeptical of the digital piece?
Yeah, there's some real tensions here that are fascinating and that we've definitely had to grapple with. I mean, first off, I should say that in practice, we are not getting resistance to the idea that making Jewish texts available online is a good thing. Nobody has actually come to us and said, you shouldn't be putting this text online at all. There's definitely concern from educators about the translation and about how you encourage and motivate language skills when so many translations are available. And we're engaging with some of those. But from a broader point of view, I do think that this is a real tension that's not just in the Jewish world, it's in the world in general, that when new technologies come along, at every step of the way, people freak out that it's going to, ruin some kind of human knowledge or human capability or understanding. Certainly, I think maybe in our life, maybe it's becoming less relevant, but there was a big debate about calculators. Are calculators going to ruin the ability of people to understand math and do math? And that was a real scare early on. It goes back way farther, though. As we've investigated this, there was, I think it's in Plato somewhere. I definitely should get a proper citation for the source, but there's a discussion about the invention of writing and how is the invention of writing going to ruin people's memory? That maybe we shouldn't have writing because people won't be able to remember anything anymore if they have the ability to write things down. And the Jewish tradition definitely has tensions around who should be allowed to open up, what kind of text. Should the text be translated or not translated? But the arc of history in the Jewish world is definitely moving towards more openness, more availability to more people. Early on, there's a moment of this when the Jewish people were in exile, came back to the land of Israel, and they mostly spoke Aramaic. They didn't speak Hebrew. The common people didn't speak Hebrew as much anymore. So there was a Jewish tradition of having a translator stand up at the weekly Torah reading and translate on the fly the reading of the Torah in Hebrew so that everybody could understand it. This is an old practice. This is not something that's new. There was definitely a tension about writing down the Talmud, that the Talmud was this oral tradition, and you'll find sources in the Talmud itself and earlier that say that you should never do it, that writing down the Torah, the Talmud, is equivalent to pulling it up by the roots or burning the Torah, that there's this serious problem with trying to make an oral tradition written. But it happened, and there was a decision that was made that said that this is, if the life of the entire tradition is in jeopardy, then let's write it down. We definitely believe it's an important first step is to give people the opportunity to find something that resonates with them personally in the first place, and that's what's going to motivate the desire to develop real skills.
If there had been a Sefaria when I was growing up, I would have ended up going there, and I definitely would have perused my way around, and I could picture somebody's opening up to Jewish text or Jewish learning or Judaism who's growing up right now. I could picture a lot of sort of Jewish origin stories. We all talk about our Jewish journeys. I can picture somebody's being, you know what? I grew up not very involved with anything. I didn't go to Jewish camp. I didn't do any of this stuff. But I found this Sefaria, and I just started reading book after book and thing after thing and making the links. And I felt so riveted. And I feel like that's probably already happening. And it makes me so excited because what's funny is it feels like sort of an inversion of what we hear from ultra-Orthodox folks who find texts outside of their tradition, and they're opened up to a set of ways of seeing the world that they never would have seen otherwise. It's this strange mirror image that I never thought about until this conversation, but which feels very powerful to me. And so I guess I'd love to hear sort of like who is your audience that you're seeking to touch with this? Like, obviously there's educators and folks who can use this in classes, and there's people that want to, dig deep into those obscure texts you talk about. But what are the other groups that you envision as using Sefaria and benefiting from what you're doing?
In some ways, I feel like there are two answers. There's the big vision, and then there's the practical. In the big sense, from where we're started from, you're not supposed to say this when you develop a product, but the answer is everyone. Everyone. We want every kind of person, for every level of knowledge or non-knowledge, to find a way in, to have some way to see if there's something interesting here. That's not a good product strategy, right? To have your target audience be everyone. So in the nearer term, we are still focused primarily on educators. And educators are sort of our most important group of people that we're working for. A second target group for us that's a little bit more broader is people who are learning today, people who already have a practice of engaging with Jewish texts. So for these groups, it's like they have a problem or a need currently, that they're currently using books or using some apps, and we have the opportunity to make their lives better and to expand what they're doing. It hasn't really been a focus in terms of the actual work that we're doing to think about getting people who don't have any interest in Jewish texts at all to become interested. I think and I believe that it is a byproduct of just putting content out on the internet and putting our application out, is that is happening to some extent, but it's not something we're working on explicitly right now. In the future, I hope that will change. I think that will change, but it's a matter of where we're growing out to right now. I will say just something that resonated with me in the question you were asking is, I do believe for somebody like me that it does feel like there's an initial barrier to overcome, that people have a preconceived notion about what religious texts are. And they think it's the Bible. They think it's like what they hear about, the Christian Bible even really still sort of flows down to a lot of just basic understanding of Jewish texts, that, okay, the texts are the Bible. You're going to Bible study, you're reading the Bible. And frankly, for me, that kind of turns me off. It's just like that's not interesting. The world of Jewish texts is just so much deeper than that. And once you get beyond the Bible and you get into the Midrash and you get in the extra stories that are added on top of the Bible, and you get into the Talmud, it's surprising. Some of them are raunchy and weird and racy and violent and all sorts of things that are interesting, right? And so there's definitely a part of me that wants to help people sort of get beyond the surface level of just like, oh, this is about the Bible, and realize that the world of Jewish texts is just a lot weirder than that. And you might find something that surprises you or interests you in it.
Well, that actually raises a question that I sort of imagined that we were going to talk about a little bit later, but I think this is a good time to bring it up. It's kind of like, well, what sort of counts as a Jewish text going forward, and in general, but this is specifically for Sefaria. Like, I was thinking as I was listening to you talk, I'm like, well, you brought up the idea that Jewish texts shouldn't only be seen as the Bible, and they're not the Bible in Jewish tradition. There's so much else in Jewish tradition, but in more modern Jewish times, the Jewish texts seem to me at least include sort of all of Yiddish literature, for example, all of American literature in English about the American Jewish experience, nonfiction, and it's, when you were talking earlier about all of these translations that you're trying to get the rights to, or you're trying to give the bounty to, I'm thinking like probably the vast majority, for sure, of Jewish-oriented nonfiction, probably most Jewish fiction, and certainly the vast majority of Yiddish books. Like, it's not like the publisher who might own the rights today is making money hand over fist on these books. They're selling in very tiny quantities. So it sort of seems like, wow, I mean, if all of those books could also be made free on the internet and translated and linked to all of the sources that they reference, I mean, A, what an amazing resource, and B, how much does that prove even more so that Jewish texts go far beyond the idea of that it's the Bible?
I mean, I'll say it's already happening currently, and where it's happening is in source sheets. So source sheets are the place where, it's your thing. You can add whatever you want to it. It's got your name on it, and we see it. We see speeches from Martin Luther King are brought in, and Benjamin Franklin and Shakespeare, and quotes from the Quran in source sheets. That's happening all the time. And it's becoming connected too, because, when you create a source sheet with a particular source in Sefaria, that gets linked to the text. So you click on the text, you can see the sheets that people have made, then you can see these other pieces of culture around the world that are already in there. I should say I do have sort of a bigger dream for the technology that we're building, is that, Sefaria is an organization that is devoted to Jewish texts. That's in our mission. All of our donors are donating to us because that's what we do in particular. But our software is not particularly Jewish per se. It models a lot of Torah values, but it's really about interconnected texts. So, one day I would love to see sort of a federation of different organizations that each take up the cause of a particular corpus of literature, a particular, body of human wisdom. I don't think it's not in our skill set to coordinate the body of Islamic texts. We don't know how to do that right. But I would love for the people who do know how to do that right to take our software and build the Sefaria for Islamic texts, Buddhist texts, Shakespeare, everything. If that happens, then you get the opportunity for the big site that connects to all of them. So in some ways, that's a bigger vision. It's not something we'll have to figure out how Sefaria relates to that, because as I say, our mission is about Jewish texts in particular. So we have to figure out how we can do the work of motivating other groups to do that. And then in the more specific for us also, we do get this question about which texts are we prioritizing to include, and will we spend our resources to start getting, Yiddish Zionist literature into the library or not? We definitely don't have all the answers to these questions. We're moving in the direction of more openness and more inclusion. The initial years, and still even right now, we've sort of been able to delay some of these questions because we just had so much work in the core. There was so much work that we had to finish in the core canon before it was even really relevant for us to be asking those questions. But we will be asking more of them. Part of it might be a matter of presentation for us. That I think there is this sense that, the Torah tradition is one thing, and it's not everything, right? I mean, it's definitely, there are connections to other texts, and it's meaningful for us to make connections to other traditions. But we don't want to, sort of completely do away with the idea that the Torah tradition is something that's distinct from other, bodies of religious knowledge or textual traditions. So we might just have to think about where do we put them and how do we display them.
Yeah, I really want to hone in a little more on the source sheets that we've brought up a couple times, because I think there's such a powerful resource that you're offering. But I want to start with a little anecdote. I was living in Mississippi for 2 years, and I went to a program at Millsaps College. It was some sort of guest speaker, and they were talking about this fascinating way of doing text learning for interfaith work between different traditions. And they're like, so we get a bunch of people and we like make a collection of different sources, and we take some from some traditions, some whatever, and like they mapped it out. And then everybody around the room was really excited about this, and I was just like, this sounds like a thing I've done 87 times in every Jewish context, from religious school to non-institutional forms of Judaism. Like, and I went up to the guy at the end, and I was like, so help me out. And he's like, oh yeah, like this is, we consciously borrowed this from like Jewish tradition. Like this is like, he wasn't a Jewish guy, but he like somehow was immersed in a context where he experienced something like what we think of as a source sheet, a physical source sheet for him and for most of the situations I've in. And it never even occurred to me that was a Jewish thing, but it was an important moment. And so because of that realization, when you launched the source sheets as a core part of Sefaria, I was just really excited, because I think one thing we can ask is, I hope that you, the Sefaria wizards behind the curtain, the actual folks, I hope that you do all this stuff and bring in other kinds of text, whatever. But the other thing is like, you know what? Maybe it's great that you're not necessarily going to do all the Bialik poems yourself, and somebody else will come along and make all those source sheets, and that will be a community kind of exercise whereby people can look at the gaps and fill them themselves. I think it's just so incredible, and we're already at a point where I know that if I am like looking to plan a class or something about Jewish texts or Jewish visions about violence or peace and justice or whatever the concept is, I already know that I can go to Sefaria, search a term, and there will be like 4 things on there. And so I'd love to hear from you more about source sheets and how they've been used, and like sort of break it down very, very practically, like what do they look like, and how are people empowered to, in an easy way, make them for themselves.
Just to break it down a little, the source sheet is this practice of Jewish educators to make a mixtape from the library of Jewish canonical sources, to usually pick a theme and take lines, paragraphs from a variety of sources that all help to illustrate a particular topic. It's a very Jewish practice in that it's about being polyvocal. It's really about having one piece of paper with multiple voices on it, and the sources on a source sheet don't necessarily agree with one another, and maybe that's part of what you're teaching, is how that they disagree with one another. When Josh and I first started demoing our initial product, we just heard the same feedback from so many different Jewish educators over and over again. They said, this is great, this is going to make it so much easier for me to make source sheets. And it was not something that we set out to do at all, but because we just heard it from so many users, we decided we needed to give it a try and see if we could really help this area. At the time, what we were hearing is that people were, they had to know 18 different websites and pieces of software about which one had which text, and they had to copy and paste the text into Microsoft Word, and they couldn't get the bilingual formatting to look right all the time. And it was just a painful process logistically for them to get through. So the Sefaria source sheet builder simplifies that. It lets you just, say the name of a text, type in a quote, a citation for a text, and it magically appears on your sheet in English and in Hebrew. The layout is flexible and dynamic, so you can move things around in their orientation without, breaking everything, and then hopefully it looks good all the time. As you're browsing the library or searching anything you can find, you can just click to add it to one of your source sheets. And you can add more things. So you can add your own questions, your own comments. You can edit and change the translations that are in your source sheet that happen just in your copy of something. So we started doing this, and we started making a way for people to publish them too. We definitely heard early on also that this was a big problem, is that there wasn't a good resource for sharing or finding other people's source sheets, and that educators were often sending out an email to some list or to a bunch of colleagues saying, hey, I'm working on a source sheet on violence. Like, what sources do you have? Do you have something for me? And everybody had Microsoft Word documents sitting on their hard drive, which were inaccessible to anyone else. And it was like this great big waste, that there was all this great knowledge that a lot of the educators were willing and happy to share, but it was just stuck on their computers. So we let people publish them. We've got now, I think, over 80,000 source sheets have been created on Sefaria to date. Most of them are private, actually. Most of them are not public. They're used by a teacher for their particular class, but we've got now almost 9,000 public sheets. And those public sheets get tagged as well. So people can say, what are the general topics that the sheet is about? And that has created, totally from the wisdom of the crowd, a topical index of all of the most important themes that Jewish educators today are thinking about in their teaching. But on Sefaria also, we're experimenting all the time with additional features in source sheets that give more of a sense of conversation, more of different people participating. So you can make a source sheet that other people can add to. So you might start with a question and one source and then post it to Facebook and say, hey, everyone, what sources do you know about that are a good addition to this? One of our most viral source sheets to date. I'm not sure how many viral source sheets there have been in the history of the world so far, but somebody made a source sheet that was called, is one permitted to punch a white supremacist in the face? Super topical, actually divisive question. And it was a source sheet that the rabbi who built it didn't do alone, but he crowdsourced from Facebook. He asked all of his Facebook friends, like, what do you think? What sources inform the answer to this question? And created a sheet that has a variety of opinions from a variety of different sources. And that was something really exciting.
the source sheets, like, it feels to me like that has the potential. I mean, you were talking about how the source sheets have a potential to be enriched and to be more and more interesting. But I'm also thinking that, in a sense, the source sheets is where you're giving people a platform to ultimately write new texts. And so putting those together, there's a potential here. I mean, what's interesting to me about the full circle dimension is that here we have some regular Jews who had this idea and felt, for whatever reason, enough empowerment and enough chutzpah to put this thing together, and over time, it in potentially a way that you didn't expect at all. There's a tool being developed out of the real needs that people are surfacing that ultimately may have the potential to empower so many other regular Jews to do what you did, or versions of what you did, or not exactly what you did, but exciting contributions in a way like Lex was saying, that when we were kids was just impossible.
Yeah, I mean, definitely democratizing access to knowledge is one of the big sort of underlining goals of this project. And by democratizing access to texts, in particular in the Jewish context, text is where the authority comes from. The authority of rabbis in the Jewish tradition is rooted in the text, and it's rooted in they're a rabbi because they know the text well enough that they can navigate them and figure out how to make a decision and a particular ruling about something. And, the expertise is not going to change, but at least access to the underlying authority becomes more and more open. And it's definitely something that we envision. We like to imagine that there's a student in some classroom somewhere and their teacher is telling them something, and they're able to do a little search on Sefaria, browse some connections, and find a source that disagrees with what their teacher says, and that they can express that disagreement in a way that's rooted in authority of the entire tradition. We like that. We like that kind of a change. I think it's more exciting when more people are able to participate because they have the ability to touch into the source of authority in our tradition. And thinking about new texts being written on Sefaria, the Torah tradition of text is not over. It's not just the texts of the past. It's still happening today, and there is alive today someone who's going to be the Rashi of our generation. And 100 years from now, we'll look back and think that, of course, that's a core part of the Jewish canon. So we're always trying to wonder how is that going to happen.
I was transformed when I saw a stat a few years ago that in the year 1300 or 1350, which is after Rashi, but there were, in the entire world, there were 300 million people, which is, of course, the population approximately of the United States now, and the global population is, 20, 25 times that. And what that says to me is that not only should there be one Rashi alive right now, there should be many. And tools like yours are exactly what makes it possible for those people to manifest and use their skills. So I love it. But before we close, is there anything, any other thoughts that you'd love to leave our listeners with as they, I'm sure, are going to jump to Sefaria and see what you have got to offer? But any other ideas or thoughts that have been important for you as Sefaria was started and has grown since then?
We had an amazing event that was organized in Israel back in November, where we were able to bring together about 100 different engineers to try to create new products based on Sefaria's data. We co-hosted this with Facebook in Tel Aviv and an organization called Kamatech, which is trying to help Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel get involved in software engineering. So we had this great room of people who had a deep Torah knowledge, and there were software engineers. What we do at Sefaria makes our data available for other engineers to reuse. We have an API, which is a system for other engineers to talk to our database and build on top of it. So it makes it possible for you today to sit down and build an app on top of the entire Sefaria library. You don't need our permission. You don't need to talk to us at all. You can just make it today. And that's something we're excited about. We think that there's a big potential for digital learning. We're not going to be the only players. We don't know the answers. We don't know all of the killer apps. And so we want to make it possible, for that mythical college student to just sit down and build her app without having to worry about getting all the content. So in this hackathon, we spent 18 hours from 5 in the evening until 10 in the morning. Just people sat down, formed teams, and built projects. The winning team was a group of 5 Haredi women who developed this app called Vort, which helps you to get one word of Torah for Shabbat. That you start with a theme or an idea that you input into the system. It can help expand it, find related topics, and it gives back to you just one verse from this week's Parsha and one comment, one connection comment, one midrash. So you start with something you're interested in, and then you land out with 2 texts that you can bring to your Shabbat table to talk about. So it's sort of, again, it's helping people get started, find a way in, but also it requires you to bring something to it. The 2 lines of text aren't going to be meaningful by themselves at your Shabbat table unless you animate them, bring them to life. So it gives you a focused way to make those kinds of connections in your life. That was super exciting to see. There were a lot of other projects that came out of this 18 hours, and we're excited for more developers to be able to build on top of what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Brett Lockspeiser, for joining us for this episode. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's been very fun.
And thanks to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we want to close it out in the same way we always do by encouraging you out there to be in touch with us. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us with a financial donation, either on a monthly recurring basis or just a one-time gift. And you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.